A very common React interview question is the grocery list. It gets asked all the time. Would you be able to solve it? Alright, let me give you the requirements. The first is that it must have a text input and an add button. This will be used to add items to the list. Second, each item should have a number that starts at 1. Next to the number should be an add and subtract button. Pressing the add button increases the number and pressing the subtract button decreases it. Third, the user should be able to check the item off their list. Now, there are 4 minor requirements as well. First, if the count of an item is reduced all the way to 0, it should be removed from the list. Second, we should only be able to add an item once. Third, once all the items are in the cart, the user should get an alert. Finally, if an item is checked off, but we increase or decrease the count, it is no longer checked off. Interviewers like this question because it tests the fundamentals of React. I will now give a solution that will surely impress your interviewers. And let's see how similar it is to the solution you are thinking of. You are watching The Helpful Coder, and let's get into the code. I have my editor open with an empty file. Let's get started by importing React and creating an empty component called grocery list. Let's then export the component. Now, in the return section of the component, we're going to add a form element. Within it, we will add an input element. The user will use the input element to add items to their grocery list. To this input, we will add the following props. Type equals text, as we only want text items. ID equals grocery item input. Min length equals 1 and max length equals 50. This is to set maximum and minimum character limits. Above the input element, we will add a label with the text, add an item. To it, we will add the prop HTML4 with the ID of our input element. This lets browsers know which input element the label is for. Finally, we will add a button with type submit. Running this code, we can see a text input in which we can enter some text. Currently, our input is uncontrolled, which means our React component does not have control over it. So let's make it controlled. To do this, we will use our first React hook, the useState hook. This hook lets us add state variables to our component. State variables are like our component's memory. They help our components remember and keep track of things. We will use the hook to control our input. The syntax of the useState hook is as follows. There are 3 key parts. The first is the variable input value. This will store the text the user has typed in our input. Next is the variable setInputValue. This is a function and will be used to update the input value state variable. The last part is the default value. For our input, it will be an empty string. To control our input, we will add props to it. First is to set its value to a state variable. Next is to set its onChange to a setState variable. Now when the user types in our input, the onChange function is called. This updates our state variable, which then displays on our input. Our input is now controlled. The text that the user has entered is actually being stored in our state variable. Now let's create a list to add items to. The useState hook will also come in handy for this. Grocery items will be the list. SetGrocery items will be used to update the list, and the default value will be an empty list. Next, let's handle adding an item to the grocery list. Let's start by creating a function called handleSubmit. We want this function to trigger when the user presses our submit button. Within it, we will use the setGroceryItem function to update our list. I'm going to write our code first, then break down the syntax. SetState functions also accept functions as props. Here, the variable prev is the previous array. The return value of this function will be our new grocery list. Our new grocery list will contain all the items from our previous list with an added item at the end. The added item will have the following fields. Name. This will be the text entered in the input. Count. How many of these items do we need? Initially, this will be 1, and the user can update this later. In cart, whether the user has added the item to their cart. Initially, this value will be false. Now, a question an interviewer might ask you is why did you use a setState function instead of just pushing it to the grocery items array? The answer for this is that state variables need to be treated as read-only. We should not mutate them. Now, we will update our form to call the handleSubmit function when the form is submitted. And finally, let's display the grocery items in our list. We will start by wrapping our return statement in empty tags. And then after the form, we will add a div element with some very simple styling. Within our div, we will map through our list and output a paragraph tag with the item name and count. We can now add items to our grocery list. Okay, but let's make it look a little cleaner. Jumping back into our code, I have replaced the top level empty tags with a div and some simple styling. I've also updated our grocery items to be wrapped by a div and some more simple styling. In an interview, you should focus primarily on the core functionality. I've only added these styles to keep this tutorial nicer to look at. Looking at the output, it's a lot easier to read. But now, let's improve some functionality. Currently, the user can add the same item to the list multiple times, and we don't want that. Also, to improve the usability, after the user adds an item, let's empty the input. These two improvements will live in the handle submit function. Let's start by adding a check to see if the item the user is trying to add already exists. We will do so by using an arrays sum function. This will return true if any item name in the grocery list matches what the user is trying to add. The variable already includes now tells us if the item is already in the grocery list. We can use this in an if statement, and within it write an alert to let the user know that the item already exists in the grocery list. Next, let's move the existing code into an else statement. This will run when the item the user is trying to add is a new item. Finally, to clear the input when the user adds an item to the list, we will use a setInputValue function to set the state variable to an empty string. Let's now test our improvements. After adding an item to our list, the input now clears, and if we try to add the same item again, we get an alert. Now we're going to add the ability to increase and decrease the count of an item in the list. Let's start by adding two buttons after the paragraph tag, one to increment and the other to decrement. Next, let's create a function to increment the cost. To do so, we will start by creating a function called increment. It takes in as a prop the name of the item we want to increment. Within the function, we will use the setGroceryItems function to update the list. I'm going to write the code first and then we'll break it down for you. The variable prev gives us a previous grocery list. The map function returns a new list, with each element the outcome of the function passed to it. In our function, if the name matches the item we want to increment, we update it to have one higher count. Name stays the same and incart becomes false. But if the name does not match what we're trying to increment, we just return the item as it is. For our decrement function, we will copy over the increment function. We will change the name to decrement and then change the +1 to a -1. Finally, we're going to update our two buttons onClick handlers to call the increment and decrement function, passing in the grocery item's name. Looking at our output, we can now increment and decrement items. But we forgot to handle a use case. We shouldn't have negative items in the grocery list. If the count drops to 0, we should remove the item from the list. Okay, back to our code. Let's update our decrement function to first check if the count is currently 1. We will use a find function to get the grocery item from the list, and then access the count to get the number. Next, we will use an if statement to check that the count is 1. And within it, we will use a setGroceryItems function in combination with the filter function to remove the item from the grocery list. Prev is the previous grocery list, and the filter function only returns element that return true in the function passed to it. For our check, it returns true for all elements besides the one we're decrementing. Therefore, our new grocery list will not have the item we're decrementing. Finally, move the existing code within an else statement. Now the user has a way to remove items from the grocery list. We only have one feature left, checking an item off the list. That means we're getting close to the end. If you are finding this video helpful, you can help me by liking this video and subscribing. Alright, to help with checking an item off the cart, we will start by creating an input of type checkbox and then placing it before our paragraph tag. We will then set the value of its check proc to item.inCart. This means that when an item has its inCart value set to true, its checkbox will appear checked. Next, to allow the user to check off an item in the cart, we're going to add a new function. Let's call it add grocery item to cart, and it takes in the name of the item we want to check off. Within it, we will use the set grocery item function to update our grocery list, very similar to how we do in the increment and decrement functions. Prev gives us the previous grocery list. We then map through the grocery items, and if the name matches the name of the item we want to update, we update its value of in cart to the negation of what it currently is. If the item is not in our cart or false, it will be updated to true or in our cart. Similarly, if the item is in our cart or true, it will be updated to not in our cart or false. The map function returns all other grocery items without any changes. Finally, to use this new function, let's update our checkbox. Within its onClick handler, we will use a new function passing in item.name. Now, our users can check on and off items from our grocery list. We only have one small thing left. Stay with me. Once all the items have been added to the cart, we want to let the user know. To do this, we will use a hook called useEffect. The hook has two key parts, the logic and the dependency list. The logic is the function that runs when the hook is triggered. The dependency list is what triggers the hook. Every time an item in the dependency list changes, the hook runs. In our case, the hook will run every time the grocery list is updated. Now for the logic. We want to check if all the grocery items are marked as in cart. If yes, let the user know via an alert. We will use the every function for this, which lets us know if all the items in an array pass the test. Now, when the user has checked all the items off their list, they are notified, and you know how to solve this common interview question. If you have any other questions you would like me to solve, please leave them in the comments below. You can find the React code used in this video in the description below. I really hope you found this video helpful, and thank you for watching till the very end. Best of luck for your next interview.